Hey everyone, prepare for an enlightening episode of Noon featuring Kevin, a remarkable paramedic whose journey embodies resilience, passion, and a commitment to service. Kevin's path into emergency medical services began in his early 20s, spurred by a profound desire to aid others in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. Starting as an EMT, Kevin initially grappled with squeamishness, but his determination pushed him past these initial hurdles. Kevin made the difficult decision to step away from EMS to prioritize his family's well-being. However, his dedication to the profession persisted, leading him to channel his experiences into writing. Kevin's first book, 1,000 Naked Strangers, A Paramedic's Wild Ride to the Edge and Back, offers a raw and riveting account of his time in EMS. Building upon this foundation, he delved deeper into the history of EMS and penned his second book, American Sirens, the incredible story of the Black men who became America's first paramedics. Join us for this captivating conversation as Kevin shares insights from his rich career in EMS, his motivations behind writing, and the stories that have shaped his journey. This episode promises a profound exploration of the human experiences within the world of emergency medical services. Let's get started.
All right, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us on the Noon podcast today. I appreciate you coming out.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're a tough guy to get a hold of, and it's understandable why. You seem to be really busy and have a lot going on in your life. Can I go ahead and get a quick introduction?
Yeah, so I'm Kevin Hazard. I wrote 1,000 Naked Strangers, which is a memoir of my time as a paramedic in Atlanta, and I also wrote American Sirens, which is about the Freedom House ambulance service and the world's first paramedics. I worked in Atlanta for about a decade, and since then I've basically been writing, working on the 2 books and, a handful of television projects and stuff like that, and just kind of trying to tell the story of this, this crazy, side of medicine that not everybody gets to see.
Right, and I did read your book, American Sirens. I actually read both of them. 1,000 Naked Strangers, and how you came into EMS. You had no real, you wanted to help people, right? But you didn't know how to do that. So you got into EMS. How did you get into that situation in the first place? Did you just go into the college, or how did you become an EMT?
Yeah, it was shocking because I didn't know anything about it. Like you said, I was just sort of searching about for some way to be useful to somebody else, and once I decided that I was going to go to EMS, this was 2002, I suppose. So, the internet, it wasn't what it is now. So I started calling, I was calling technical colleges, like 2-year community colleges, and just seeing who had a program. And I wanted to know who had the one that was starting the soonest. And so I think I was making these calls around December or January. I found one that started in March. And so I signed up, and I had, like a lot of people, had no idea what I was getting myself into. I specifically remember that first night sitting down and flipping through the book and immediately getting nauseous. And I'm not a squeamish person, but there was something about the reality of knowing that, oh no, I am, looking at the degloved finger and looking at, weird burns and electrical burns and realizing oh, wow, the next time I see one of these things, I'm going to be standing over it. And it was just such a horrifying realization. You're like, 23, 24, and suddenly find yourself in a situation. I was totally overwhelmed.
Yeah. How did you push through that? That's typically people would know, I'm not going to become an EMT because I'm squeamish. Sounds like you didn't really know until you started flipping through that book. And those books have a lot of really graphic pictures. So how did you push through that?
I mean, that's kind of the way I've always been. As a kid, I would climb lots of trees because it scared me to be way up high, but I loved that feeling of being scared. I've always really enjoyed that. It's kind of what helped me with writing. There is nothing more intimidating than approaching somebody with the power to make your dream project come true. And so when when you have an idea for a magazine story and you approach the editor of a magazine, it's kind of a terrifying experience, because if this person says yes, you are then going to have to deliver this magazine piece. And it's not for, your friend Steve down the street. It's for, a real publication where they're going to expect that you know what the hell you're doing and you can actually deliver on what you've promised. And it's a pretty terrifying feeling. And so, I sort of liked that. And, there was this baggage that I brought into the class to begin with, which was that when I was in college, I had led these jet ski tours in the intercoastal waterway around Charleston, which, intercoastal waterway runs up and down the entire East Coast. And Charleston, South Carolina is a city that doesn't really have beachfront property. It's surrounded by all these barrier islands. Charleston itself is a peninsula with a river on either side, and then the harbor, and then all these barrier islands. And so there's all these creeks and bays that run in and out of there, and we would take people through them. But these are narrow places that become narrower still depending on the tides. And there were two guys that were on there, and they were just acting like typical 27-year-olds, and I was 19 and trying to control them, and they weren't going to listen to me, and they crashed, and one fell off, and his friend kind of zoomed over the front of his jet ski and went up in the air, came down the bottom of the jet ski, and jet ski's a heavy thing. The bottom of the jet ski hit him in the face, ripped everything below his nose off. And he was just floating in, 75 feet of water with half a face, and stuff just dribbling into the ocean. And, it was a very overwhelming. We were 2 miles from the dock and a long way from help. And thankfully there happened to be a doctor that was nearby, and he jumped in the water, and somebody on his boat radioed for the Coast Guard. But, I kind of just sat there panicking, and that stuck with me, that it just, that moment, that panic, that kind of doing the one thing that they ask you not to do in an emergency. I had a hard time shaking that. I really did. And so that was in the back of my head as I sat there that first night, listening to my instructor, lay out what it was we were going to be doing, and then looking at the pictures of it. And I thought, like, all right, you bungled this once before, you cannot do this again. But it was nerve-wracking. And I'm sure everybody has a similar experience when you're going through EMT school. At some point in that class, you realize that it's not hypothetical, that there's going to come an end, that the class is only a step to get you on an ambulance. And once you're on that ambulance, you're going to be expected to perform. And it's, it's kind of nerve-wracking, because that inevitably you're going to be put in emergencies where somebody's life could be on the line, depending on whether or not you make the right decisions or how quickly you're able to act. And that's intimidating.
That is very intimidating. And having done EMS now for going on 20 years, I know that feeling. How long would you say it took you before you felt comfortable after your EMT class, before you felt confident in taking care of people?
My instructor was really good. So I entered into it with a strong understanding. But of course, as you know, it's all about getting that information from your head to your hands and how quickly you can do it. One of my first days, there were two guys. They were, like old hands. One EMT, one lifelong EMT. One of those guys is like 58 and still an EMT. This is like strange breed of characters who are just,
Yes.
they're drivers, and they're like expert IV guys and expert backboarders and mountain goats when it comes to carrying people, but they just don't want to write a report, and they don't want to, maybe they've been to paramedic school 3 times and never finished. So that's who it was. It was an experienced medic and an experienced EMT, and I watched how quickly they flew around the back of the ambulance. And everything, it was like watching an episode of The Bear. Everything was flying around, packages are being opened, things are being handed. There's this communication that's taking place without words. And of course, I'm in the way. The thing about third riding is it's almost designed to make you feel worse about yourself than you already do, because you're a third person in a 2-person crew in a space that's really not built for 2 people, let alone 3 people. And so you're 100% in the way, and you're completely useless. And I'm watching how fast they moved. And I remember I went home and I told my wife, I was like, there's no way I'll ever do that. I will never be able to function as quickly as these guys do. But it's pretty shocking how quickly. I feel like after a couple of weeks, you've run enough calls that you're at least comfortable in an ambulance. And then once you run your first it doesn't have to be an arrest. It doesn't have to be, an exploding baby or something. But once you run that first bad respiratory call where you have to move quickly and you realize like, oh, I didn't panic. I just like I knew what to do and I followed my partner's lead because I'm a new EMT, but I did what had to be done. I moved quickly. I moved swiftly. Like I was comfortable. I understood what was happening, what we needed to do, and that was, I had one of those when I was a paramedic, and I had one of those when I was an EMT, and those are kind of like those settling calls, that just like brings everything back down, and you realize, oh, I've done it, so I guess I can always do it.
Like at the very least, I can get this person from point A to point B, right?
Right, without setting them on fire.
Yes, exactly. Without setting the patient on fire, your partner, the truck, the like everything. Yeah, no, that's a good one. So what did you do before EMS?
A little bit of everything. My senior year in college, I was accepted into the Peace Corps and I was going to be going to West Africa because I had done this study abroad and I spoke French. And then I meet this girl who's like, hey, that's cool. But when you return in 2 years, I'm not going to be here waiting. So suddenly I had to make this decision. Do I go to West Africa for 2 years and probably longer? Like, would I have immediately come back after an experience like that? Probably not. Do I do that or do I give this relationship a chance? And it was clear that there was something here sufficient to that. I was like, okay, I can't just leave for 2 years. So yeah, I turned down the Peace Corps and then graduated almost immediately and then realized like, oh, what am I supposed to do now? And I had no idea. I had a plan. I'd already devised a plan and executed on getting that plan taken care of and was set to do it. Now suddenly I had no plan. And so I got this job, a horrible job. I was selling software over the phone. It was like maintenance and manufacturing software. So you would call these big manufacturing plants and talk to these guys. My territory was New Jersey, and I remember I had these two clients. One was Tony Jacopino, and the other one was Mike Scaglione, and which is great. He called and he's like, "Yeah, it's Tony Jacopino. What can I do for you?" And I remember Mike Scaglione. Mike Scaglione, how are you? He worked at a concrete place, which a dude named Mike Scaglione working at a concrete place in New Jersey, you automatically just assume that he's burying people in the river. But you had to call these guys and talk to them about, these are like, you know, guys like my dad, like blue collar, factory manufacturing, manual labor kind of guys who are busy, and you're calling them to say, hey, let's talk about your computer system, which I'm sure they did not like to begin with. And it was, this was 99. I'm sure it was pressed on them. And so they were so you had to like figure out how to get above in the company, which a lot of people could, but I couldn't because I was a crappy salesman. And so I quit. I was the worst salesman in the company. I quit and then wasn't really sure what I was going to do, but I had written since graduating a couple magazine pieces and I was like, I think I really like this. I remember the day the first one came out. I woke up the day that the magazine was going to hit newsstands. And I remember I turned to Sabrina and I was like, I know what I want to do for the rest of my life. Like, this is it. This is what I am. And so when I quit, I got a job at the newspaper and I did that for a while, which was exciting and rewarding and, can be really cool. And then 9/11 happens and everything kind of changed, like suddenly overnight, there's this whole new thing happening. And there was, which is almost impossible to believe now, but once upon a time, there was this real feeling of collectivism in the US. We were all in this together. And, I wanted to help. I wanted to be part of something larger than just, a young writer in a newspaper. I wanted to do, not just observe. And so that was kind of what led me to down this path of like, how am I going to do this? And then one night I covered a tunnel collapse and I encountered some members of the city's high angle technical rescue team. And I was like, I don't know that I necessarily am jacked up about firefighting, but like there's something really cool happening here. And that was the start of it,
The EMS side, yeah. So where were you and what were you doing when 9/11 happened?
I was in Florida. I was writing about in Tallahassee, there's a big children's hospital. So I was writing this, they were in the midst of this big fundraising campaign. It was all the stuff that was going on. And they were trying to revamp this hospital and I was writing about it. So I'd gone down the night before. It was, the whole thing was so strange. I went down the night before, and if you've never been involved in fundraising, like what you don't realize is that your town, no matter where you live, um, is filled with like sort of powerful, wealthy people, and they're everywhere. And so these are the people who come out of the woodwork when, some sort of big thing is happening at like a museum or a hospital or wherever. And so when I went down there to cover this thing, I was, I had to meet these people who were involved in this thing and get my head around this effort. And so again, I'm like young, and I'm at some huge house in Tallahassee. It's out on some kind of water or something. And there's like, I'm like drinking scotch, which I don't know, 23 or something. I did not drink scotch. So I was like, man, I'm not going to be good in the morning. And it was this whole big thing with all these sort of really wealthy people. And I very much felt out of place and like an imposter. And then I wake up in the morning and I go to the hospital, and I I was supposed to spend a day with the nurses in ER and ICU. And I walked into the break room, and everybody was standing in there. And this was, like 8:36 or whatever. And the first plane had hit, and the second plane had not yet hit. And then shortly after that, the plane hits the Pentagon. And I don't know, it was such a surreal day. But what made it crazier is around the time that the plane hits the Pentagon, that's kind of when I realized, like, holy crap. Yes, there was something crazy that happened in New York, but this is something even bigger than we feared. Everybody just go home. So I jumped in my car. I had gotten a rental car and driven from Atlanta to Tallahassee, which is not short. So I had to make this drive back, and they're blocking the roads off everywhere I go. Like, cops are coming out and blocking the roads off. And I didn't realize that video of George Bush reading to kids in an elementary school was in a Tallahassee elementary school.
Oh,
So I'm racing his presidential security detail out of the city because they're blocking everything off so that he can get an unimpeded ride to wherever Air Force One was parked. And I could literally see them dragging out barricades and police cars right behind me. So, I mean, it was like a scene from an action movie where I was a second and a half ahead of each barricade that got laid down, and I barely snuck out of town. And so I spent most of 9/11 in a car driving through rural Georgia, listening to what was going on over the radio, listening to the towers fall, listening to the fallout, listening to Flight 93 crashing in Pennsylvania, but I hadn't seen any of it. And when I got home, I told my wife, I was like, I got to turn it on. And she was like, I cannot watch another minute of this. Like, I'm going in the other room. I can't watch it any longer. And so I sat there by myself, sort of stunned, and just watched this. But it was very strange to be, alone for 6 hours in a car with, just this steady drumbeat of doom coming over the radio.
yeah, not having any idea of what's going on and what's happening next. And yeah, that had to be scary. I was in a classroom, and I was in high school, so I don't want to age myself, but I was in high school when 9/11 happened, and it was literally every class we went to, we would go and just move like sheep into the next room and watch TV. Nobody was teaching that day. There was nothing going on. We were just watching.
Yeah, those are I was in school when the Challenger blew up, and I remember we were joining another class to watch the thing, and like there was some kind of hiccup, and we got stuck. Like they did not bring us in quickly enough, and so half the class was in the room, half the class was in the hallway when it exploded, and also the teachers were like turning and trying to push all the kids out of the room. So because we're all like, what is happening?
Yeah.
But yeah, I can't imagine sitting in a class of 9/11. I'm sure absolutely nothing got done.
No, nothing for that whole, I don't think anything for that whole week got done. But I think I knew then too that I wanted to be in a position where I could help. And I had known for a while that I wanted to get into the fire department, but I was just not old enough, and I didn't have any resources to help me figure that path out until I was 18 and I can go do it on my own. So that's how that started. But I know that you worked for a while in the EMS system, and then you got out to help take care of your kids, and then you started writing the books. While you were in the system, do you feel comfortable sharing like maybe one of your worst calls or something that just really has stuck with you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few. I've always said that it isn't the gore and craziness for me that was made it difficult. In a weird way, it almost always felt like you're watching a movie, when you see someone ripped in half, and it's almost like your mind can't really put what you're looking at into context. I mean, guts are just not a thing that are supposed to be strewn across somebody's lawn. But there was this housing project in Southeast Atlanta. It was not that far from the federal penitentiary. It was just sort of a forgotten part of town, a rough part of town, and the others were, or at least were under the process of being rehabilitated. But this one was so far out there that nobody paid any attention to it, and it just sort of lingered for years and years. So it was just, the people who were there were forgotten, and the place itself was forgotten, and it was a pretty dismal. We've all had those places. There's just some addresses that just, that are just so hopeless. You know what I mean? You can feel it, when you get dispatched there, and you always tend to run very strange calls there because, it's sort of it's a weird breed of person that ends up there. And we got called out one day. I can't remember what it was for. It was for something simple. It was like for a fever or something like that for a child. And we came into the house, and there was all sorts of craziness, because I want to say that the cops had gotten there before us because maybe the address had been flagged as problematic or something. But I don't remember that ever being communicated to us by dispatch. And so we got there, and cops were there, which, again, not totally, not out of the norm at all to see cops on your scene. And we walked in the door, and there was a kid. He was probably, let's just say he was 13, but he could have been older. And he had on just a t-shirt, and he'd clearly been, he was like kept in some sort of a, cage is too strong of a word. That's not the right word, but it was like a giant playpen kind of, without, like, almost like they built a little enclosure, because the floor was just the floor. There was no bottom to this thing. He was just standing on the floor. But he lived, I guess, in that little enclosure, and he had Down syndrome and was totally unable to communicate and was very freaked out. But he was covered in cigarette burns. And I just remember walking in, and like the whole picture, both like the adults that were there that were clearly either enablers or abusers, this kid, like the cops are freaking out. They were really charged, as you can imagine. And we were just trying to, the child was kind of our responsibility. So we were doing all we could to just keep our heads and just be calm and try to calm him down, because, understandably, like, he was totally freaked out. All of us in there, all the noise and the activity, on a kid who clearly had major developmental issues, and who knows what, if anything, had ever been, taught to him, but he was just, like, you didn't even know where to touch him. And I just remember my partner saying, like, repeatedly, just like over and over again, it was like, God, they're brutal motherfuckers out there. God, they're brutal. And he just kept saying it. And I was just sort of like, I just remember feeling helpless and horrible. And, this child was really in a horrible situation. And what is the solution for, like, what is the state going to do for this kid? Because clearly he's never going back to that house. And probably those people are going to jail, although that whole system is so messed up that who knows what's going to happen with that. And it was like a scary feeling, because it had this odd, kind of Silence of the Lambs feel, the whole house, the way the whole thing was set up, and him, just the condition he was in, and how scared he was, and how, like, I felt horrible for, like, it was like emotionally, physically just exhausting. And you realize, or, and sort of instinctively, it's in the back of your head, that this kid's not alone, like, maybe not necessarily in this apartment complex, but maybe in the next one, or the next zip code over, like, people, like, that sort of thing is happening, and nobody knew it was going on in there, presumably, or somebody would have called earlier. So those things are happening. They're happening all the time. And when you realize that, and you're kind of looking at it and seeing that, how easy it is for somebody to get away with that is, it was horrible. But that was one of those things, and there, to me, the worst ones were always something like that, a family member or a loved one who's left behind to witness or, to be involved in something really horrible. Um, I that was one of the worst for sure.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a very hard call. And I can, empathize with you because we have a lot of child abuse here in New Mexico. And it's so sad. And this is just from my point of view, but these kids are getting abused and they're getting sent off to, CPS or, any other type of protective services that we have available. And there's nowhere to put them. So they contact not the parents who had control of the patients at that time, but then they're contacting like the aunts, the uncles, the grandparents who accept these kids. And then what happens in the next 30 minutes? Guess what? They're right back with their parents. And it's so unfortunate because there's a lot of these kids that are falling through the cracks. And I've talked a lot about this, about child abuse in the state of New Mexico. And it's just, what can we do for these kids? We don't have enough houses. We don't have enough homes where these kids can go. The whole process is really hard. So it's really unfortunate. I'm glad that you talked a little bit about it, though. You said that the parents or the caregivers were there. How hard for you emotionally was it to step back and not say anything to them or even physically do anything to them?
I mean, I had so many instances like that, where you look at the parents and you just can't believe the environment that they're raising their kids in. There's poverty and then there's neglect, even if you remove the abuse that this particular call had to it, where you just get furious, and you think like, God, there are children in this house. How are you doing this to these kids? And it is infuriating. And that one maybe a little bit less so because I think I was kind of, there are some calls that just sort of put you on your heels and you never, you know what I mean? Like you're not quite rational. It's a bit like, when you run, when you have a bad respiratory call and you walk in the door and that person is like standing up and freaking out, you know what I mean? They're like on the furniture and the eyes are bulging out and like you never really have time to think, and you get to the hospital and someone's like, hey, do you have his insurance card? And you're like, dude, you're lucky this guy's wearing underwear. Like we are here in a rush. You just never quite get your feet underneath you because you're moving so quickly and the patient is so desperate and you're so aware that if I don't do this really fast, and by the way, it might happen anyway, but this patient's going to die if I don't do this really quickly. And so you never get your feet under you. And that was how that one was. It was so, I guess disorienting is the word for calls like that, and again, we've all had them where it's not like you do a bad job, you do a good job, but you're moving so fast and you're so laser focused on the task at hand, which, for a respiratory call is like, don't let this breath be the last. And for a thing like that, it's like, calm this kid down and move him to this ambulance, which is a near impossible thing to do. You're so focused on that you almost don't have time to look out at the larger picture and kind of wrap your head around where you are, as opposed to the call where you get called, for a woman with a headache. And when you get there, there are, kids in the house who are, totally neglected, and you have time to kind of look at the situation and go, like, what are you doing? I feel like I was always more at risk of getting myself in trouble on a call like that.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. It is hard. There have been a couple of times where you walk in on the scene and there's not anything that you can do for that child. The child is too far gone. And you have to either grab your partner's hand or your partner has to grab you, but by the elbow and walk you out to keep that scene under control because the cops aren't there yet and fire's there and you're getting all upset. You're all agitated. This is something that could have been prevented and it's not because there were probably drugs involved or, a lack of education, some sort of miscommunication, anything that could have been done differently that could have prevented that child dying, and it didn't happen. And that can be quite a charged scene. One of the first stories that I heard coming into EMS was a guy called, it was a dad called for his baby, saying his baby was upset, and that was it. And the EMT and the paramedic got there. I don't think at that time they got there before fire. I don't remember how that situation was, but they got there, and the dad, they walk into this trailer, they walk up the stairs, and the dad is sitting there on the couch watching TV with a beer bottle in his hand. He said the baby's in the room. And when they went into the room, they found the baby in the crib, and the baby had a large dent in his head and had passed from head trauma. And the EMT like lost his shit and went and beat the crap out of the dad because nobody else was there, and what do you do? What do you do in that moment? It's so hard, and it's hard to explain to people who, like, lay people who aren't in EMS or in the healthcare field at all. Like, these are emotions that we have to deal with and then shove it down to keep going, right? Because back then, and I'm 5-10 years ago even, you didn't see something bad and get to go home. They didn't have the staff to cover. Who's going to take care of these people when you're gone? You know what I mean? You had to finish out your shift and keep trucking.
Yeah. No, completely. And not even, there wasn't even a willingness to acknowledge that something was wrong. You just didn't discuss it in any way. I remember very early on, I ran this, I was a magnet for OB calls. I mean, I delivered so many back what was going on.
Oh no.
But I had several bad OB turnouts, and early births and stuff like that. But like late enough to be that it was tragic.
Fully
for
formed. Yeah.
Which are always difficult. And I had one of those, and we came back, and we were cleaning up, and I was a new medic, and I was kind of, that feeling you have when you were handed a pretty crappy call, but you dealt with it well, like it all went the way it should have, and it's kind of a good feeling. And so I wasn't like bouncing around and like bragging, but I definitely, and again, I wasn't saying anything, but I felt it inside, like, I feel good about this. Like that was a tragic situation, but my partner and I, like, we were on it with that one as well as it could have. Like, I feel good. And somebody said to me, he was trying to be helpful. He was like, hey, just, I heard that call go out over the radio. My wife works in that NICU, and she said, you guys, whatever, that it went well. You guys did a good job. He's like, but, don't tell anybody that. Like, nobody cares. You did it. It was a bad call. You did a good job. But, my advice to you is, not that I was going to, but my advice to you is don't brag about it. Just sort of swallow it and move on. And at the time, like, my initial thought was like, okay, like, all right, whatever. I wasn't going to brag about it, but like, that seems like a great way to earn enemies. But okay, I point taken, like, don't tell war stories at work. And then as I was sitting there, I was thinking to myself, man, if you're not supposed to tell people when something goes right, again, like, we all know that, something going right does not include the patient's outcome. That's your performance in the moment. If something goes right, you're not supposed to tell anybody. So what about when things go wrong? What about when it's horrible? What about when I feel horrible? Like, do I also then just have to swallow it? And of course, the answer was yes. And that was the approach. And, luckily the world has changed, and people are more open about it now than they once were, more willing to talk about it, which is good, because, it's really the idea of like, oh, we'll work this night shift, and then everybody will go out for kegs and eggs, and then you'll go home and sleep, and then we'll come back tomorrow and do it again. Like,
I've not heard of it that way. That's a kegs and eggs. Oh my God. Oh, that's pretty good. No, I do think that we are in a position now where it is becoming more open and more openly talked about, and people are allowed to share how they're feeling. And hopefully that will put us in a position where EMTs, paramedics, firefighters, all healthcare professionals will be healthier in the next several years than we have been in the last few years. And hopefully that'll also work to decrease suicides. But we'll see. And we'll see. I think a lot more people are open to it. So I think it'll be good. I think it'll be good for the profession as a whole is in healthcare.
I agree. I agree. I mean, anything you can do to reduce burnout and, keep people kind of on an even keel, and I think is I think is good because the job is taxing, and you're not soldiering. So there's this idea that, like, oh, if you're not killing and being killed, then these other terms don't apply to you. Um, that's just not the reality. It's just not the fact. We can pretend that it's the case, but it's not. If we're
Yeah,
being
no,
honest with ourselves, it's
I
not.
agree 100%. I agree 100%. So can I get a quick synopsis of American Sirens?
Yeah. So in 1965, as we all know, the white paper came out, and it said essentially that paramedics were too few to be there when you needed them and too unskilled to be of much use when they arrived. And because of that, tens of thousands, maybe more Americans were dying unnecessarily in this, what they're referring to as epidemic of traumatic deaths, preventable traumatic deaths. And so there was this need, flag had been set up that, hey, something needs to be done. There needs to be someone to take care of patients from the moment and place of insult up until they reach, you know, uh, the ER. And there was nothing like that. And so two things happened sort of simultaneously. One is that in the city of Pittsburgh, there's this guy named Peter Safar, who's a Austrian-born anesthesiologist, the father of CPR, who had just gone through a horrible tragedy himself in which his 12-year-old daughter died of an asthma attack that she had at home because the people who showed up, she was with the babysitter, and people who showed up did not know what to do. So she wasn't breathing from the time they got there until the time she got to the hospital. And so though they were able to resuscitate her, she was brain dead and was gone. So he has this very personal, he's obviously an incredibly bright guy. I mean, he invents CPR among other things, and he has this very personal need to do this. And so he sits down by himself and he draws up what today we would recognize as the world's first paramedic curriculum at a time when the word paramedic didn't exist. And he has this genius idea. As we know now, it's going to change the way lives are saved around the world. And it is, this 9-month class that teaches the full spectrum of emergency care, all the things we do today, everything from seizures to OB to cardiac to trauma, overdoses, everything. And he follows that up with time in the OR, the ER, the ICU, OB, the morgue, just like we do now. And he has this brilliant program that is going to, if utilized, is going to train this new breed of professional. The problem is he doesn't have the people to become this new breed of professional. He has a great idea, but nobody to carry it out. Simultaneous to this, there's a neighborhood in Pittsburgh called the Hill District, which was the city's Black neighborhood. And it had been pretty severely devastated by urban renewal. Much of the neighborhood had been torn down with nowhere for the people to go. Overnight, about 12,000 people were displaced where they would live, time when there were still housing covenants. So Black people could not just move into any old neighborhood. So 2/3 of the neighborhood got crammed into the remaining 1/3. And, so all the businesses were torn down, homes were torn down, so jobs are gone, crime and drugs immediately rise. So in 1965, that's where the Hill District is. It is Watts, it is Harlem, it is south side of Chicago. And so there's this guy named James McCoy, and he was a civil rights activist, and he was living in Pittsburgh. And he decided to create this organization called Freedom House. And its sole purpose was to provide job opportunities for people living in the Hill. And he's having a very difficult time finding inspiring careers that are going to lift people to another level of society. At that time, the things that were available to, Black men and women were essentially housekeeping and gardening and things like that. So he's trying to find, so here he has, James McCoy has all these people without a job, and across town, Peter Safar has this incredible job opportunity with no people. through this sort of wonderful bit of kismet, they meet and they discuss both Saffer's revolutionary idea and McCoy's group of sort of willing and eager lay people. And so they come together, and that is where this idea is born for the first class of paramedics to be from Pittsburgh, and to be made up entirely of Black men from the Hill District. And that's the birth of paramedics as we know it. That class began in 1967. They began working in the beginning of 1968. And so the story follows it follows the sort of the conditions that created the need for paramedics. It follows the birth of the paramedic, and then it goes into the lives of both Peter Saffer and Nancy Caroline, who was one of their medical directors, as well as the lives of several of the original paramedics. And we see what brought them here, the challenges they had to overcome in order to become a paramedic, and then the challenges they had to overcome just to continue to work as a paramedic, but also their drive. I found it incredibly interesting that so many of the people who came to this, they arrived at an ambulance because they were looking for a way to sort of make their mark on the world. And of all places, that was where they chose to do it. And it's just the story of this incredible 8-year run of freedom medics and the people who did it.
Yeah, and it's a very, very well written book. I actually really thoroughly enjoyed it. I listened to the audiobook and it was pretty amazing. What got you, what gave you the idea to start this book and then to finish it?
Somebody sent me an email in the summer of 2018 and said, "Have you ever heard of Freedom House?" And I had not. And I was willing to bet that a lot of people had not. When I was in EMT school, we talked about the first night, we talked about Napoleon and the flying carriages, and we talked about the Civil War and World War I. And then somebody mentioned the white paper. And then next thing you know, it's Johnny and Roy and it's, craziness. And here we are. There was never hey, so the bridge that got us from 65 to, the National EMS Act several years later was this group of people from Pittsburgh. And as a paramedic, as someone who spent a decade on an ambulance, a very formative decade, and my life was shaped in many ways by that job. I just sort of took it personally that there was this origin story that I didn't know and that none of us knew, and that hadn't really been talked about and celebrated and brought back into the light. And so I started researching it, and came across several of the people. And once I got to know them, it became, I knew it was an incredible story. It was how this whole thing came to be. The people that, again, just Peter Saffer by himself is fascinating. Nancy Caroline by herself is fascinating. John Moon or George McCary or anybody, Mitch Brown, anybody who's involved, Bill Rainovich, the first white guy who came in as this token white guy, any of them were fascinating, but they're tied to this incredible story. And then at each level, you uncover something more intriguing and more interesting. And then more people come in, and it just, the detail gets richer and fuller. And then you realize that, wow, what they were overcoming, what they were going through represented, everything that was happening across the country, from medical advances to racism to poverty to the downside of urban renewal. All these were nationwide problems that were all represented in this tiny microcosm of this little neighborhood, doing this little job that nobody had ever heard of, and just became so fascinating. It's just kind of one of those stories I couldn't walk away from.
Yeah, and it was an amazing story. It was not something I had ever heard of previous to reading your book, so I'm glad that I was able to come across. Actually, Dee Finder, who's another author, he wrote Ready Left, Ready Right. I don't know if you've heard that one. He's the one that suggested reading your book, and so I got the first one, and then I got the second one, and I couldn't stop. So it was good, very good stories, very well written stories. Do you have plans for more books?
Yeah, so I'm working on right now about, it takes place during the 2014 Ebola epidemic. And it's about this group of people who developed, an incredible group of, and a tiny, like a very tiny, very dedicated, very like smart, but also kind of crazy group of engineers, pilots, and doctors who developed and deployed this technology to transport highly infectious diseases around the world in an airplane. And they had the technology, they had never used it, and then Ebola happens. And the sort of thing to infectious diseases is, you know, there is no African country, there is no Asian country, China included. There is no Western country that's prepared all by itself to handle a major outbreak of a highly infectious disease. And what they were finding through these various outbreaks, whether it was SARS or H1N1, all these different things, and eventually Ebola, was that experts were becoming hesitant to go because there was no way to get them out. If you volunteered because you were an infectious disease expert to go to, the rural Philippines in the midst of a typhoid outbreak, if you got sick, that, should something go wrong, I could theoretically die. That could happen, but
Yeah.
you're going to do it at home. You're not going to be left, 12,000 miles away. And so people were beginning to get hesitant. These experts were saying, I'm not sure I want to do this. I'm not sure I want to put myself in harm's way if there's going to be no contingency for getting me out if I get sick. And so it was very much a pressing issue, and nobody was certain what to do with it. And this group of people came up with um, the solution. And so, the book takes place over the course of 10 days where they do the first two evacuations of any human being with Ebola, at a time when there was really no treatment and no country would allow you even into their airspace if you were transporting an Ebola patient. But they managed to pull off this incredible rescue, and then this piece of technology is now carried forward and was used extensively in COVID. So it's this crazy story of like, it's kind of part Apollo 13 because it's got this like impossible rescue mission that has to be done. It's part outbreak because you're following this really scary disease, and it's kind of part Argo because you're watching this plane get in and out, and you're wondering like, are they going to be able to pull this off? And it's funny, it's harrowing, it's exciting, and it's really amazing, the people who did it and made it happen. So.
Well, that sounds awesome, and I look forward to reading that one. Do you have an expected date of release?
I don't. I've got to turn it in. Um, I've got to finish writing it in 24. So, hopefully, the next 8 months or so, I finish it, and then from there, once it goes to the publisher, then it enters into this very strange and unpredictable production line, where it's like all these facts, and then they need to decide when. When my first book came out, it was published in January of 2016. It was going to be published in late 2015, but Bill Clinton was coming out with a memoir, and my publisher was like, "You do not want to have a memoir come out around the same time as Bill Clinton. Let's hold off." And so they're like, all book sales are going to go to that guy's book. So let's wait 3 months. And so you just never know. I mean,
That's true.
Michelle Obama might come out with a crazy plane book and, tank me.
Yeah, no, that's true. So you talked a little bit about working with some TV shows as well. Does that have anything to do with the books that you've already written, or are you working on other stories?
A little bit of both. Both Strangers and Sirens are in development, which is a long, slow, and kind of maddening process. And I obtained the rights to another book about this really incredible story that involves the flying doctors,
Mm-hmm.
and in East Africa, and we're writing a feature script based on that now, myself and two other guys that I work a lot with, and so we shall see. I mean, I've been involved in television writing since 2015. I've written a billion more things than the world will ever see.
Yeah.
So much of what happens out there because I'm cheap, like you can get me to write a script and then you can decide you don't like it. You can light that thing on fire. But once you bring in actors and start cameras rolling, that's when things get very, very expensive. And so, a lot of things get commissioned, and then like one of them will get made. So we'll see. Hopefully these get going. But again, you really gotta enjoy the process, which I do. It's a lot of fun.
Well, that sounds exciting, and it does sound like a lot of fun, and I hope the best for you. That is super exciting. So when you were working in the field, did you write your stories or did you wait till you were out to write?
I kind of started at the end. Strangers started as a blog, and the reason I did it was because one, my friends were always asking me to tell the same story over and over again. Pick any crazy, funny story. And you know how it is, your friends are like, oh, tell them that time that there was that dude with the cucumber in his ass. Tell him that story. And you're like, oh, I don't want to tell that story to your grandmother over
I
dinner.
know.
So
Yes.
I started writing them because I was like, look, one, I'm forgetting details. Like some of these stories now are years old. Two, um, I'm getting tired telling them. And so I just started writing. I had no interest in writing an EMS book at all. This is what I did for work, and I didn't want to do that when I went home. But when I started writing these, I realized immediately that people liked them, not just friends or friends of friends, but that blog kind of got spread all over the place, and that was the first idea where I thought like, oh, I guess there's like people really like this. Maybe I should look into this, but I wasn't sure how to do it until I left. Um, I kind of took being gone and not being on an ambulance to really understand what the job had meant to me. If I had written it while still working, I think it would have been very different.
So that kind of leads into the next question. Like towards the end of A Thousand Strangers, you talk about your dropping down to part-time and then leaving ultimately. And it almost sounded like you were disinterested, like in the job still, right? Like almost like you were burnt out and you were just ready to leave. Is that how it was?
Completely. I was very burned out. Grady, and there are other systems like this. Grady's not necessarily unique, but we would run, I don't know, 125, 130,000 calls a year.
Yeah.
We worked 13-hour shifts. You might get lucky and only run a few calls, but you were running 8, 9, 10 calls depending on what they were. A lot of them were short transports. There's a ton of churn, and at a place like that, there's a lot of turnover because a lot of people can't handle it, and they leave. So you're always at low levels. You show up in the morning and there's just it's run, 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 and it just I allowed myself to get worn out. You have to be aware of when you're having those kind of moments and like take a step back and figure out how to recenter yourself, if I can sound woo-woo for a minute. But that's what you need to do. And I didn't do that. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't think to do it. And I got very burned out. And when I decided to leave, it was, like you said earlier, it wasn't an entirely work decision. My son had been very sick when he was little, and was in the NICU for a while, or the PICU rather, for a while. And he just, every time somebody sneezed around him, he would get really sick, and I would have to call out of work and, do FMLA to take care of him. And, it was nebulizers and the whole, and he was young. He was really young. He was only a few months old. So it was taxing. And that was going on. We had a second child coming, and it was like, I'm already not sleeping because I'm working nights and I'm up all day with him. And I'm gone half the time. That's why I'm part-time. And, so I just kind of said, maybe it's time to just walk away. And I just remember my wife saying to me, like, essentially, like, what took you so long? Like, I could see that this needed to happen for a while. So I'm not sure why you didn't do this earlier. And it was good. I mean, I think sometimes you need a change. A good friend of mine, we worked together on the ambulance. He was really burned out. He left, he went to a cath lab, and it like restarted his life. He's unrecognizable from the guy. We all know that guy, like really bitter person shows up, has been there forever, like a 13-year vet, and just walks through the door and is just like pissed off, and the supervisors try to ignore him because they know he's a jerk, but they also know like whatever he's going to do the job. Let's not start a fight today. Let's not try to fire him today. And and he was just bitter, and then he left, and he got, you know, a job at a different place, and his outlook totally changed. He recently moved down to Florida, and he looks wonderful, you know. And I see him, I'm like, God, I love this for you. I love this version of you. It's you know, it's nice to see people recognize that they you know, that they need to make a move and do it.
Right. Sometimes it takes some of us just a little longer than others, I think. And then sometimes we need that little push, like your friends telling you, hey, you need to get your shit together and get away. You need to find something else.
Yeah. Yeah, it happens.
It does. It does, unfortunately. I do want to discuss one more. It was more of a funny time that you referenced in your book where you said you guys were sitting outside of the prison facility and you talked over the PA and said that a prisoner had escaped. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. So if you've ever picked up an overtime shift on Sunday, you know, two things. One, that it sounded like a great idea on Thursday. It's a horrible idea Sunday morning. And the other is that there's nothing going on a Sunday. So you're basically going to be sitting in an ambulance staring at the windshield, you know, waiting for some old lady to fall in her kitchen. And that's what we were doing. We were down by the penitentiary, which, you know, is one of those places where you could be busy or you could not. We actually covered the penitentiary, so it was, you know, we ran a lot of calls in there. And so we were just kind of sitting around, and not every ambulance had a working PA, but this one did. And so I just grabbed it and I keyed it up. And as soon as I turned it, you could hear that, you know, kind of clack that the PA made. And so I knew, it was like, oh, wow, this thing's working. And I think I said like hello a couple times and something like that, you know, just being goofy. And then I don't know where the idea came from. I think it just happened. I said, can I have your attention, please? There's been a jailbreak. I repeat, there has been a jailbreak. And that was it. We kind of turned it off. And within a couple minutes, some guy came storming out of his house. He was so angry. And I remember we had a pirate flag hanging from his porch. I remember thinking, like, if you have a pirate flag hanging, you know, like, and you're a hipster, like, you don't have a right to come over and start yelling at me. But nonetheless, he did. He was furious. And as he was yelling, I don't remember now who it was, whoever was sitting right next to him, we just sort of like reached over and pushed the button on the window and just went, and just shut right in his face. And at that point, he levitated with rage. And we got a call maybe 2 minutes after he stomped off. And when we got to the call, supervisor was there waiting for us, and he was like, dude, I don't know if I'm going to fire you today or not, but this is not good. That guy is pissed. He knows someone who works at Grady. Like, he wanted us prosecuted for a reckless endangerment, because he said announcing that there had been a jailbreak within a block of the federal penitentiary was similar to walking into a crowded theater and screaming out fire. And so he wanted us to go to jail. He wanted us arrested for reckless endangerment. And I mean, all I could think about was like, one, what a clown this guy is, but two, like, what was that? You know, there are some things you cannot explain. And I remember my mother saying to me when I was a kid, like, if think about this before you do, like, think about how you're going to explain it. And if there's no good way to explain it, then don't do it. And it was one of those things where there was no good way to explain why I would key up a microphone in an ambulance and warn a sleeping Sunday morning neighborhood that there had been a jailbreak at the federal penitentiary that they were living in the shadow of. It was such a terrible idea. But the funny thing is, I get away with it. Somehow the whole thing blows over. The woman who ran our department at the time happened to find it, you know, a juvenile and stupid thing, but also kind of funny. And so I did not get in trouble. But that story, I mean, that is like, it just stuck. Like, everybody, classes of new hires were told the story of, you know, so there's this guy Hazard, and he did this thing where he keyed up the mic, and it was jailbreak, and it, like, other services knew, all the nurses at, you know, because if you work 911 in the city of Atlanta, you're a Grady employee, so, you know, we knew the nurses really well, and they were talking about it, and the doctors in the ER were like, which one of you guys did the jailbreak thing? And like, they were cops. Like, it just became this, like, it became this thing, and all I kept thinking was like, why, I don't know why I did it, but how did it become like, this is what I'm going to be remembered for when I leave here. I'm going to be remembered as the guy with the jailbreak. And to this day, I've been brought back to Grady to speak a couple of times, and I go to get-togethers and stuff like that, and inevitably I'm the jailbreak guy.
Yeah.
People are like, hey, man, that's the dude I told you about. I told you I knew him. That's the jailbreak guy, man. And it just that's what I am, and I'm okay with that. I can live with that. If that's my penance for doing something stupid, making several generations of medics laugh, then good. I'll take it.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I remember one time working at the volunteer fire department, we were sitting in the brush truck and we were working a standby for, I think it was called the X Games, where they come and do crazy tricks and stunts and stuff. And I was sitting in the back seat, and two of the guys were sitting in the front, and one of them had keyed up the radio and didn't realize that he had keyed up the radio. So they were talking shit to each other, and I was I was sitting in the back and I was like, fuck you, motherfuckers, just talking shit. And all of a sudden, all of our phones are blowing up. And I'm probably one of, if not the only female working at this like big event. And now my voice is all over the radio. Fuck you, motherfuckers. And oh man, our phones were blowing up. We had the supervisor come knock on the window, tell us
Oh, that is the worst.
mic, like, to chill out. Yeah.
Somebody's radio holster like bumped up against the seatbelt, and keyed up.
Yeah. Everybody recognized my voice because I was one of like, I think 5 females in the volunteer fire service at that time, like around the area that we lived in. So it was very recognizable.
That is terrible. Oh, that is terrible. Hilarious. I bet everybody else is dying, but oh man.
Oh yeah, no, everybody was dying. It was a good time. Those were good times. I do miss the volunteer fire service that I worked for. We played a lot of pranks, and you just don't see that type of community anymore, like you used to.
Yeah, that was, I mean, the pranks were, we had, which, I mean, it's probably a horrible way to do it, but we had nitro paste, which is, I mean, again, got to be like the least exact way to deliver a medication of all time.
Yes.
And so we would take the paste and put it on doorknobs and stuff.
Yep.
So someone would open a door, and 2 seconds later, they'd be like, what the, down they go.
Pass out. Yep.
Which is so dangerous. If you think about what you're doing to people, we would do that, and it was so, I mean, it was the funny, like I loved, much less dangerous, but we would hang D550 either over somebody's bed, like put it through a little crack in the ceiling, or put it over over their head in the ambulance, and just turn it to like 1 drip every couple minutes, so that they're laying there and it just get like sticky, and at some point they're like, what the frick is going on, and they're just like if you hang that, if you move the drop tiles over somebody's bed, I worked briefly at a place I was stationed at of a firehouse. Just move the drop tiles and put a little drip set down there, and it would just drip every once in a while, and you just get everything all sticky, and they'd be like, what the frick is going on here? Why am I so sticky? But yeah, those pranks were, or taking somebody, because, back when everybody just left their ambulances running and keys in, you just hop in the ambulance and drive it around the corner, and they come out and they're like, what the hell?
Yeah, stolen ambulances.
Yeah.
Never a good time. I just want to give you the opportunity to, if you want to go ahead and shout out your book, and then if you have a website and all that other stuff that you would like to talk about, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about American Sirens, which is really, an incredible story. It's just, it really is the origin of our field in a lot of ways. And, it for too long, it was, it was a piece of forgotten history, and the people involved have waited a long time to be recognized for what they did. And I think they're finally getting that. And, I'm proud to have played a part in that. And so, the paperback edition of American Sirens just came out. And so you can get that anywhere that you get books. And it really is an incredible story, and it's one worthy of people knowing. So you can get that there. I do have a website. It's kevinhazard.com. And of course, I can be tracked down on various social media sites. So, Naked Strangers is, my story. It's a personal story, and I'm proud of it. And, a lot of people have seen themselves in it, which is really, a great experience. But, American Sirens is a story that is much bigger than me, and is important in different ways, and in that regard I'm really proud of it. And again, like I said, honored and humbled to be a part of this reawakening of a story, to see these guys decades later. This all happened before I was born. To see them decades later getting the recognition that they, not necessarily that they waited for, because I don't think they were waiting for anyone to pat them on the back, but recognition that they knew deep down that they deserved and had never gotten. It's rewarding. And so, and frankly, I think it's rewarding as a read. To know this history and to understand, a bit about where we came from beyond just Los Angeles or Miami or Seattle. To have a more fuller understanding of how this profession was born, and who is this Nancy Caroline behind emergency care in the streets. These are all things to be explored, and hopefully that we can take something from.
Yeah, no, and again, like, props to you. Is a very well written book, and it shows a side of EMS and you pointed this out, that just a lot of people don't know. So I think it's going to do really well, and I think it's going to blow up, and I hope it gets a lot more of the attention that it deserves, and that the guys get the attention that they do deserve, having started up such an incredible EMS system. So that's awesome. Well, thank you, Kevin, so much for joining us today on the 911 Nonsense podcast. I appreciate that you took some time to come out and hang out and chat with me.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, I appreciate you. I've been a pain in the ass, so I appreciate you chasing me down. And, it's been, it's absolutely been wonderful to come and talk to you, and, I'm happy to do it. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, no problem, Kevin. Thank you so much. I hope you have a good rest of your day.
All right, you too.
Thank you for listening. Before we wrap up, we have a few important announcements to share with you. Firstly, we're excited to announce the launch of our brand new 911 Nonsense Facebook group page. It's a community where everyone can go to connect, share ideas, discuss topics from the show, and get all of the most recent updates about the podcast. We'd love to have you join us and be part of the conversation. Next, we want to ask you to rate and review our podcast on your preferred platform. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us reach a wider audience. By rating and reviewing the show, you'll be supporting us in a big way and helping others discover 911 Nonsense. If you enjoy what we do and would like to support the podcast even further, we have a few options available. You can visit samspursuit.com to find the links to our 911 Nonsense merch page and our recently released Noon gear page. Every contribution, no matter the size, goes a long way in helping us continue to better the podcast. We know that not everyone is comfortable being on the podcast, but we still want to hear your stories and experiences. If you have a compelling story and would like to share it to be read by me in a future episode, please reach out to us via email at 911nonsense@gmail.com or through our website's contact section. If you choose to be anonymous, we'll make sure to respect your privacy while sharing your story in a way that resonates with our audience. Thank you again for tuning in. We truly appreciate your support and look forward to bringing you more engaging content in the future. See you next week.